Here, welcome to the Garden Report back again, less than 12 hours later, packing in shows here. Head of Summer League will be out there starting tomorrow, but first, want to talk about Oshae Brissett with someone who watched him over the last couple of seasons, someone who knows him well, and a fan favorite here on the Garden Report. Caitlin Cooper is back. They loved you, Caitlin. I had to bring you back. Probably the highest approval rating of any guest we've had here. And I'm excited about what the Pacers are doing, too, this offseason. It's a team I enjoyed watching last year. Really, the last couple of years is Island built a little bit of stability and direction here off that Domantas-Sabonis trade, which I do want to revisit as well later. But Oshae Brissett, I was really excited when this happened. I covered him at Syracuse for 2 years. He was an excellent player there his freshman year, came into the league with Toronto, developed quite a bit there, got some playing time in Indiana early and often, and, built on the development he achieved in the G League and in that Toronto system there, and really showed some stuff over the last couple of years here. And you're a fan of this signing, I believe. You had some good things to say about him and how he might fit in here in Boston. And what was your overall assessment of his time in Indiana and just him as a player and the time you got to see him there?
I mean, I think the trajectory was up and down a little bit. I like what you just brought up about him being in the Toronto system and coming over, because when he first came out of the G League and was playing with the Pacers, he was playing for Nate Bjorkgren, and that's really when he started to pop. And that was kind of one of the last exciting things you could hold on to at the end of that season, was kind of Oshae Brissett and Edmund Sumner and what they were doing with that team. So he shot the three incredibly well over those last, I think, 20-some games. I think he was around 40%. He was really cutting well off of Sabonis. They had pretty decent chemistry. There was a lot to like there. So then the Pacers obviously retained him, and then they make the coaching change. And he wasn't right around in the rotation right away under Rick Carlisle. It took injuries kind of both the last 2 seasons, especially this past season. Even during preseason, Kendall Brown had even leapfrogged him during preseason play. Oshae was kind of one of the last couple of players off the bench, and it took injuries at the beginning of last season. Aaron Nesmith was out for a little bit. Chris Duarte was out with his ankle injury. Then Andrew Nembhard was out. And then Oshae kind of had his moment against the Raptors where he came in, and he's a guy who can change the game really quickly with his energy. I'm not going to evoke the spirit of Marcus Smart here, but he does play with hustle pumping through his veins. He plays with a lot of ferocity, where, he's going to get out and leak out. He's going to crash hard. He's going to keep possessions alive. He does a lot of little things that don't necessarily show up in the box score, and those are a little bit cliche, but I do think that describes Oshae Brissett. A very timely cutter. I think the biggest thing that was holding him back with the Pacers is that if his three-point shot isn't falling, his finishing, I'm just not convinced that's fully going to come around for him. And that's gone back to his time at Syracuse, I'm sure you remember. But for him, a lot of times, stuff that should be a layup ends up being like a hanging bank shot. His finishing on drives has only been last year, I think it was right around 39%, 38%. It's usually in the mid-30s each 3 of the seasons that he was with the Pacers. So he doesn't adjust very well against verticality or help. He doesn't get a lot of elevation off of 1 foot. That makes it very hard for him to adjust. So I'm not particularly bullish on that turning around at this given point in time. But when the 3 falls for him, he can be a useful player.
Yeah, and it did not last year. The numbers have slowly creeped down to earth a little bit off that hot shooting year he had to start it off there in Indiana. And even going back to those Syracuse days, that was the swing thing for him. If he was hitting threes, everything would flow from there, and he'd be incredibly effective. And then same deal with Syracuse, a down shooting year in year 2 just led to uneven results across the board for him. But great physicality, a great NBA body. He's got the 7-foot wingspan. He's got that burst, the athleticism. He's had a few highlight reel dunks in his career so far, including against the Celtics. His best career game, many people remember, probably came against the Celtics.
And that's actually kind of telling. That's actually a good game to go back and look at from last year. If you look at the 2 games that he played against Boston after Tyrese came over from the trade, I think that would be telling for Celtics fans, because the first one, when he made 6 threes and had 27 points, he was being defended by Robert Williams in the way that Ime Udoka schemed, where Williams was more of a roamer, and then he also caught the Daniel Tice at 4 minutes. And that was very beneficial for him, to the point where at halftime they actually switched that matchup, which, as you know, covering the Celtics didn't often do. They ended up putting Tatum on Oshae coming out of halftime in that second half of that game. Then when they went up to Boston, they had injuries. So I believe they started Goga and Terry Taylor in that game, which put Oshae at the 3, and then he looked a little bit different in the light. When he's being defended by 3s versus when he can, maybe get something off the dribble going against Daniel Tice, he looks a little bit different. So I do think ideally he plays the 4 for the Celtics next year.
Right, and that's a spot that's open now, especially on nights where Al Horford sits. There'll be opportunity there. If they play bigger, they'll probably go with 3 wings across the perimeter there, and he'll have that open space playing alongside Tatum and Brown. I do think that's a lineup that they can go to if they want to play more of a wing-oriented lineup rather than double big, which, now that they're stacking up this roster around 3 bigs, they're probably going to have to do that more often than not. So I'm sure Brissett's minutes will probably come and go along the perimeter, but when you lose Grant Williams, as they did yesterday, that's a real opportunity for Brissett to step up. But there's some key differences between these guys. He doesn't fit in seamlessly to that Grant role to me just because of the shooting inconsistency. I mean, love or hate Grant, he was 40% last 2 years pretty steadily from 3 for the most part there, hovering close to it. Elite catch-and-shoot guy in the corner. And Brissett's just not that. I mean, I don't know what you see mechanically with the shot. It's a little strange to me. It kind of goes way over the top, and I think it's a little inconsistent sometimes, at least remembering his earlier days shooting the 3 there. He's capable of really getting hot from there, especially he'll be shooting almost exclusively open 3s, I'm sure, with the Celtics here. But just mechanically, is there something you see there with the 3 that has led to him being all over the place?
They've made adjustments to it. In his first season with Rick, because Rick can be a little bit of a shot doctor, they adjusted his hand placement a little bit, and he had better results for a few months, and then you kind of saw him kind of reverting back to the original form again. That's in part why I think he fell back out of the rotation. Guys got healthy at the end of last season, but once they traded for Wara, I just think that they trusted having somebody out there who could shoot and do more things than Oshae could, even though Oshae probably has a slight edge over Wara defensively. But what you just said there too about the openness, like when he first came over and was playing when Sabonis was still on the team under Bjorkgren, almost 70% of his shots, his catch and shoots were uncontested.
Yeah.
So, and 75% of his shots were either 3s, cuts, or offensive rebounds. Like that's really the lane that you want him to stay in. And I do think, like offensively from the Celtics perspective, at least from me on the outside looking in, when you were watching in the playoffs, is like they should have a more dynamic drive and kick offense than what they do a lot of the time. Like they have 5 guys, they have lineups of 5 guys that they can put out there who can dribble, pass, and shoot. They just don't always get that, going into the blender. So,
You
they
know
don't
what it
necessarily
looks like. You know what it looks like when they're getting those layers of passes and secondary drives
Mhm.
and things like that, and it doesn't happen often enough.
Yeah, so if they can get the secondary drive, something that Oshae does really well is he cuts off of secondary drives quite well. So there was a shift, like, a lot of the cuts that he got, he finished better on cuts when Sabonis was still on the roster, because one thing that goes underrated when you have a playmaking big is that big is occupying the big away from the rim. So he wasn't having to go and finish with, the verticality like I mentioned before. Now when Tyrese is clearly capable of passing people open at the rim, but when it's a point guard doing it versus when it's a center doing it, you have somebody different to contend with around the basket. So that was one thing. But one thing that Oshae does, even as a cutter, is he's very good at collapsing the weak side zone and then opening shots for other people. So, what we call a cut assist, where you drag in that defender and then maybe the guy in the corner gets an open shot if somebody like Tatum or Brown drives the baseline. He's very timely with that, and he doesn't spoil spacing when he does it. He knows when to get into the lane, or, if TJ McConnell is the guy who can really turn the corner out of pistol, if he gets 2 feet in the lane, O'Shea's a really good 45 cutter, and then he can complete those 45 cuts to go ahead and get an offensive rebound. So I do think, in the sense that I thought during the playoffs, you could tell at times from Boston, if they got secondary drives, a lot of times people didn't necessarily cut. I think that's something
Right.
that Oshae would give them.
And that's something that goes back years with them. They haven't had a lot of great cutters, which is what excites me probably most about Brissett coming in, is opening up that part of the game for them. Like Jalen will do it. He'll have spurts where he's great in that area. But a lot of the time, it feels like the system, especially, is holding them back in that. They just want guys and spotting up, and they want high numbers of 3-point shots. And back to your point about the secondary drives and just opening up the offense a little bit more in layers there. They're taking that first three when it's open a lot of the time. So I worry slightly, and I kind of want your take on the offense that the Celtics ran last year, that more often than not, when they're finding Brissett in the corner or wherever it might be, they're going to want him taking that three if he's open, upwards of 70% of the time, maybe even more with the Celtics team. They're going to want him taking those threes. They're going to want him probably increasing the amount of threes that he takes there. And if he's more of a skilled cutter, and I know we talk about like his inconsistent finishing and such, but I don't want him being an exclusive spot-up three-point shooter, which they've done with Al Horford, which they did with Grant Williams, who wasn't exceptional going downhill. But if this is a guy who can really open up some stuff getting downhill toward the basket, I want them to take advantage of that, and I'm just not super convinced they will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a main difference. Like the game that I mentioned when he came in and scored like 6 points in a flurry and kind of changed the game against Toronto earlier in the year for the Pacers. He's a guy who, when he stands in the corner, if the Pacers are running pick and roll, will do like a Corey cut or a blade cut where you face cut in front of the guy in the corner as the pick and roll is going. I don't think that Boston does a lot of that during pick and roll action. I think that what you're saying with Missoula is more accurate, that they would rather have those guys spaced so that they can get the higher number of threes. Like O'Shea's not somebody who's going to pass up an open shot. I just think it's more in his nature to be finding little crevices. He's a very resourceful player. So, like I said,
and they play fast, which will help.
Yeah, and he does that as well. Like, I mean, he made a joke when Tyrese came over because the Pacers obviously changed their transition frequency up a lot once they had Haliburton, that, he transformed into a track star when Tyrese got in the lineup. So he does leak out a fair amount. So you have to look at that and give and take with the rebounding. The Pacers have been a very poor rebounding team for roughly 2 years, and that's clearly not on Oshae Brissett, who is, a fringe rotation player for them the last 2 years. But it's always something you have to look at when you have somebody who leaks out a lot.
So the defense, I want to talk about this because I do find it interesting, the direction they've gone in defensively here and what signings like these ones say in Brissett and Delano Banton coming from Toronto, Grant going out, Marcus Smart going out this offseason. Last year, we definitely saw this Celtics team get away from switching everything and having that be their identity and more toward luring teams in the mid-rangers, dropping quite a bit at that 5 position with Al Horford there. Getting a 7-3 guy or whatever Kristaps Porzingis is into that spot is going to be helpful there. But they also have a lot of guys in Brissett and Banta now, long wingspans, guys who are going to guard space really well, I think, as much as being switchable, which was more Grant Williams' forte, more Marcus Smart's forte. The defense Brissett brings to Boston, how would you assess it, and how do you think it fits in with some of the things they did last year on that end and the direction they seem to be going on that end?
Yeah, I mean, Oshae will not be a one-for-one swap with what Grant Williams did. He's not somebody. There were times over the last few seasons where the Pacers like to do a fair amount of cross-matching where they might, like, especially when Sabonis was still on the team, they might put Oshae on, like, Vucevic and let Sabonis guard Patrick Williams, for instance, so that then you can switch on ball screens. But I don't really think that's his strength because he's not the strongest player. He doesn't have a lot of core strength. So if you're up against somebody and he's defending a 4, or if he were defending a 5, he can get pushed around in the post pretty easily. The Pacers didn't always let that happen. He didn't guard a lot of post-ups last year because they doubled the post a lot if he was defending it. So if you were looking at like, oh, we want to replicate more of what Ime Udoka did, we're going to have Oshae defending 5s, like what Grant Williams would do, and we're going to switch those ball screens. I don't know that that's going to be super successful because he doesn't necessarily hang against 1s on cross matches either. I think he's more somebody that you want guarding 2 3s and certain 4s depending upon what the skill set is. But he's pretty effective, I feel, at being a help defender at the nail and as the low man. He has pretty good feel for when to slide over and, come in and out of the sideline, contest shots that way. I think that that's his strength as a defender more so than defending on ball or positionally against, 5s or 1s. I think that's more what lane you want him in.
And you showed a little bit of that here. I'm going to play that tape you sent over to me of the Oshae experience here. And if you want to walk through it.
I think this summarizes who he is as a player pretty effectively.
On both ends here. So let's see. Hopefully this comes out clear for everybody. Yeah, it looks good. All right, let's run it.
Yeah, so they have Jalen Smith on a switch because the Pacers switch pretty much everything when he's out on the 5. So Shai Gilgeous-Alexander has the ball, and you'll see O'Shea collapse on the drive, force the ball out of his hands, recover back to Poku on the perimeter. I think that's Poku. And then when they put the ball on the floor, he slides in again. The ball gets loose, and he dives on it because that's just what type of player he is. He's going to play, like I said, with hustle pumping through his veins. But then offensively, when you get to the other end, he catches the ball as the trailer, puts it down on the floor, and then that's when you see some of the struggles that he has. He's just not the most suave with his footwork. He's not getting a lot of elevation off the rim, but he gets his own miss and gets a putback and ends up getting to the free throw line. So I kind of feel like that's a pretty effective summary of what Celtics fans should probably be expecting from O'Shea when he comes over to Boston.
Yes, and you love the hustle. You love the rebounding. I always thought he was a strong rebounder going back to the Syracuse days. In fact, he had the most double-doubles. I love this stat. I throw it around all the time. As a freshman, Coleman and Carmelo Anthony, which are two pretty good names to stack up with back then. And the defensive intensity was good. I find it pretty impressive that he's translated defensively, given that he came out of the zone. That can be trouble for a lot of guys, and it's why a lot of Syracuse guys, frankly, haven't survived in the NBA. But he brings that good physicality, and he's helped it translate here. So offense is going to be a big thing. He does need to fit in offensively if he's going to play for this team, particularly when they have an Al Horford who's so good for what they want to do, who moves the ball well, when they have a Robert Williams who's so effective off the roll and rebounding himself. There's a lot of options in that front court in front of them that play there, but losing Grant's a big one. It's not interchangeable, but minutes-wise, there's 10, 20 minutes there for you to steal when Grant played, though Grant was a DNP pretty often late in the year himself, and now Porzingis comes into the fold here, another body. So I'm excited about it. Minimum. Can't go wrong. They get the second option there, which is good for Brissett. So we'll see how this goes. And as far as the Pacers go, I do want to talk a little bit about them because I find them interesting this year. I do think they could take a real step here. Haliburton locked down long term. Bruce Brown comes in at $22 million on a weird deal. A second-year team option. I think that's good for the Pacers. Some flexibility for them to maybe keep him around at that number again next year, or work on something long term if he fits in seamlessly here. Buddy Hield's still there shooting. Obi Toppin comes in, who I love, on that rookie deal for a couple seconds. Those seem to be popular assets now, so we'll see how that goes. A guy to fill that 4 spot that was pretty open for Indiana last year, and then Jarris Walker comes in the draft. So overall, what excites you most about Indiana's offseason? Because they've been very busy.
I think that I would describe it as I like all of those moves individually in a vacuum. They had to spend $18.5 million at least this summer to get them to the salary floor, so they needed to give that money to somebody. And I know that there was a lot of criticism for it being an overpay for Bruce Brown, but like you just said, it's basically a 1-year overpay for a guy who's coming from a winning culture, who can fit in and is very malleable. I think we'll see him do some of what he did with Denver in terms of he really got out on the break, catching hit-ahead passes from Jokic. Tyrese ranks in the top 10 of the NBA and throwing pass-aheads according to Second Spectrum. Bruce Brown's very effective in transition. The Pacers ranked 4th in transition frequency, and I also think he'll mix in some of what he did with Brooklyn, that the Pacers really like guard screens. I think you'll see Bruce Brown hit the ground running and rolling with the Pacers in a lot of ways. And defensively, they just needed an upgrade. They don't have a lot of guys who can defend on ball. I think that he'll be very helpful in that regard. That was a main talking point. The Pacers ranking 26th in defensive rating. They needed help defensively pretty much everywhere. So that's a big one. Obi Toppin fits right in with the transition points that I just made before. I think all of them are very close. The 3 of them very close to the top of the league in transition efficiency. You're going to see a lot of Obi leaking out, and that kind of goes back to what I just said about O'Shea. The Pacers not a good rebounding team, so there might be a little give or take there. I do think he can do more than what he was doing in New York's offense because they had Julius Randle, they had a center who, and Mitchell Robinson, who needs to be in the dunker spot. His reality will be a lot different, wherein I think that Tyrese will augment his strengths and Miles will accommodate some of his weaknesses better than what you saw in the New York Knicks. That being said, I have some questions about how I like all of the moves in combination. Right. I support all of them individually. I like that they drafted Jarris Walker. I don't know. I think that they're going to be trading off what they had in spacing last year. In a lot of ways, it's going to be a big difference going from having Andrew Nembhard in the starting lineup, Buddy Hield in the starting lineup, Aaron Nesmith at the 4 spot, to going to potentially Benedict Mathurin Bruce Brown and Obi Toppin. In terms of, even if those guys are knocking down shots, the defensive perception for them is going to be different than what you saw, obviously, with what Buddy Hield can do and what his gravity is. So I think they're going to have to tinker with lineups, but as the people saw last year, they started Jalen Smith at the 4 to begin the year. Midway through the year, Aaron Nesmith was starting instead because that's just what worked better for the team. So Rick Carlisle has shown that he's willing to adjust. So if stuff isn't necessarily working for them, I think that they'll do a lot of tinkering. And the Pacers kind of have to add people on the margin. They're not going to be signing, top tier guys. So they have to overpay to get veteran players. You have to, take a deal like Obi Toppin and hope that he pops in a different environment. So I think individually, all of it, you give them a thumbs up for most of it and you hope that it works out in the aggregate.
Yeah, and that can be tricky. They're comfortable with it. They've had to do that the last couple of years, almost as much as any other team. The amount of guys that have been in and out of this lineup's been pretty staggering over the last couple of years here. And you look at this roster again, a lot of these guys are back, a lot of new faces, as you said. And how do you manage that as a coach? Carlisle is pretty good at it, but it's a blessing and a curse having, let's say, 13 guys potentially who could play here, vie to play on any given night, depending how the rookies pan out. And a lot of guys last year, like you said, who were shooters, who were spacing oriented, Hield. I thought Nesmith made some real progress last year with this group. And if he's heading back to the bench, maybe more limited minutes, that's not something that suited him well in Boston. Looking back on those days, like he needed that shot. He needed those shots, the rhythm overall to get going effectively. And they needed a little bit more at the 4 for sure.
Yeah.
But there's a give and take, like you said, between guys who space the floor well at that position, even if they're a little undersized for it, and guys who might bog down this offense a little more. But when you shoot the ball like Turner did last year at times, that can help.
Yeah, I mean, Miles definitely had the best season of his career last year. It made a difference for him to be a 5 defended by 5s, and that's kind of an underrated piece of this. Because if you look at his shooting splits over the last 2 seasons when he was defended by forwards by comparison to when he was defended by centers, it's like a difference of him being a 40% three-point shooter to being like a 32% three-point shooter. And that was in part why they took Jalen Smith out of the starting lineup, is because there was a lot of teams. They went on a 7-game West Coast road trip at the end of November, and you'd start seeing, okay, Zubats is guarding Jalen Smith now. Sabonis is guarding Jalen Smith now. And those guys were just sagging off, and then they were switching pick and rolls with Miles. So that impacted him. So you kind of have to ask the question for the Pacers, like, is it inevitable that opposing teams are going to cross-match Miles, or is there something that you can do about it? And is it the best thing for the team if he's having his best possible season? And that isn't necessarily a knock on Miles, but, like, do you have to play so small with like Aaron Nesmith at the 4 that defensively now you're hampered in certain ways where you're having to double all over the place and you're giving up too much on the glass? So I think that they kind of went in the other direction of that, but now they're at risk again. Like I said, if Obi Toppin isn't hitting shots from the perimeter, it's possible that they're going to cross match that. It's possible that 5s will start guarding Obi Toppin. And, you have to ask too, like, Obi's going to be up for his rookie extension. That will have to be something they consider before the season starts. And you just drafted Jarris Walker, and you're hoping, right, I would guess, when you take somebody at number 8, that they will eventually be a starter for you. And Obi's coming from a system in New York where they basically never switched. Like, Tibbs doesn't run a switching scheme. So if you look at the numbers for him, I think he switched on like 18% of the screens that he defended. That's going to be vastly different with the Indiana Pacers. Nesmith switched on like 79% of screens at the 4. And even if you look at Jalen, he switched on over like 35%. So you're going to have to do a lot of switching, and that's more Jarris's strength more so than Obi's. I mean, we'll wait and see what Jarris looks like here in Summer League. But to this point, from what I've seen of both of them, I would trust Jarris to switch out more than Obi Toppin.
Right. And I'm excited about Toppin because he didn't play enough in New York, frankly, to see what he's capable of here. I have my doubts about the shooting with him. I think it's going to be more slashing, rolling, whatever it might be, depending on the position he plays there. So the 4 is going to be tricky for him if he doesn't prove to be a great shooter here. Though playing next to Turner, a guy who spaces it.
No, it will be helpful for Obi. It's just a question of Miles being marginalized back on the perimeter and how he handles that. But I mean, the fit for Obi Toppin is definitely there.
Right, and you see him starting right off the bat at the 4 next to him.
That's my expectation just because of what they just did with Benedict Mathurin. I mean, Jarris is a higher feel player than Benedict Mathurin is, but they brought Benedict off the bench and coached him harder and wanted him to earn those minutes. So I kind of have my suspicion that that is the same trend that will follow and that Obi Toppin will be the
You're
starter.
right, Mathurin, Toppin, Brown. Brown had a great shooting year in Denver, but I don't think many look at him as a shooter specifically. Like his best plays downhill toward the rim. All three of those guys really that's the case. So that will put Turner back on the perimeter. And Haliburton's a guy who's going to make it work with almost anyone offensively. But there are a lot of, I think you described it well. Like, how does this all come together? These are all great individual pieces here, but this team as a whole, how do they make it work? Because one thing I'm going to say here, just to make it matter for the Celtics audience here, this team was the 6th seed last year. Right up until that day, Haliburton went down and was in and out of the lineup with injuries there. So they had something that worked to some degree last year until, they started taking a step back and, taking the long view there down the stretch of the season. So this is going to be a little different. They've reinforced the roster definitely here. Haliburton, I think, is going to be a guy who raises anybody's level playing alongside him. But is this a fringe playoff team? Is this a team that could make a little noise in that bottom half of the East here? They were last year, in my view. And now working in some new guys might complicate that. And the East is just a little bit better as a whole, it looks like, this year.
Yeah, if you look at just the games when Miles and Tyrese were both available, I think they had the same win percentage and net rating, just barely negative 0.5, I believe, is what the Miami Heat had last year. So that is not me saying that the Indiana Pacers are going to the NBA Finals next year, but that they would have probably been in position to be, a fringe play-in team. Maybe frisky in the play-in tournament. Maybe they get into the playoffs at where they were last year. I do think that they made upgrades. We'll have to see how it all comes together when they're out on the court, obviously. But I mean, I do think that this could solidly be a play-in team, maybe a playoff team. Because like you said, before Tyrese went down, they just never really regained that same magic that they had. And I don't think that was all solely on the fact that they didn't have Tyrese anymore. I do think that them playing, 8 guards a night next to Miles Turner and what they had changed up with their defensive scheme, I started noticing when they went 1-9 in the stretch when Tyrese was injured, that teams were finding little hacks defensively for how to attack that. They were playing, for instance, the Oklahoma City Thunder, and they started putting Miles last season a lot more on low usage wings and using him more as a roamer because they needed to switch to keep him low around the basket. So like they used Josh Giddey and posted Miles Turner. That's a very unusual thing to see, a guard posting a big, but that occupied Miles outside of the paint. Then they could run split action and it's guys just, Shea's just getting a cut straight to the rim because Miles isn't there. You can't expect Buddy to be the low man. So there were little, like I said, faults that were starting to get uncovered in addition to them just not having Tyrese to be the engine of everything they do on that end of the floor. But yeah. And then just looking at the bench stuff, like what you mentioned with Buddy, he's going to be in a contract year, most likely sliding back to the bench. Andrew Nemhard, I felt really popped. I mean, he's an underrated player who I
another
really
guy
adore.
that needs to play.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And if you're looking at starting Benedict and Bruce and Obi potentially, and Andrew slides back to the bench, what are you doing with TJ McConnell? Because at that point, I feel like Andrew really needs to be the reserve point guard and running offense, because that guy can make some heady passes out of the pick and roll, and he's going to need those opportunities. So they're going to have stuff to figure out for sure rotationally.
I got 2 more big things to talk about here. A year ago, we were discussing how Malcolm Brogdon might fit in with the Celtics after a trade between these two teams. And he went out and won the 6th Man of the Year award, made a big impact in Boston, stayed healthy right up until the end. And then he ends up in a trade to the Clippers for Porzingis that falls apart. Has been in rumors nonstop since, has 2 years left on that deal, a hefty deal that sent him out of Indiana last summer. So I do want to assess his future in Boston and kind of where he's at in his career year out of Indiana here. But first, a quick break for our sponsor. All right, our next partner is AG1, the daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health. I drink it every day. 75 high quality ingredients that give me all the nutrients, energy, focus, strength, and clarity I need every day to hit the ground running. If a comprehensive solution is what you need for your supplement routine, then try AG1. You get a free year supply of vitamin D, 5 free travel packs of AG1 with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/garden. Make sure you hit that. drinkag1.com/garden. Check it out. That's AG1. Yes, of course. Support the sponsors. Also, while you're here, while you're in the chat, go check out Caitlin's work. She's now writing on Patreon at patreon.com/basketball she wrote. You can go over there and subscribe to her work, covering the Pacers better than anyone. And she has for a long time. It stunk seeing you get let go. I didn't need cornrows there, Caitlin, but the way people rallied around you was really awesome after that. I remember the tweet you sent out got like 1 million views or well over that. So I hope everything's been going well over there ever since.
Yeah, an adjustment to switch platforms for sure. I think a little bit of the million views had to do with Tyrese just being a very nice human being and sharing that tweet and being willing to support my work. He's, been tremendous. I never asked for any of that, and he's just done that because that's what type of person he is. But yeah, back to Malcolm Brogdon though. He definitely took a step forward with the Celtics by taking a step back, right? I think that we talked about when I was on here that he was a guy who was going to need to slot into more being, a spot up role where he can attack straight line drives, shoot off the catch more, have less burden to be manning an entire offense on his own. And now you kind of look, and without Marcus Smart, he's going out to Memphis. Porzingis is coming in. I presume they're going to start Derek White at the point guard, but does Malcolm need to take on more of that again without Marcus being there? And can you rebuild the bridge? I think is a question that you kind of have to ask. Like, Malcolm now knows that you are pretty much going to trade him to the Clippers. How do you get all that back together? And I think in the past, I've kind of looked at that and been like, oh, you can't unring that bell. But just to relate this to the Pacers and maybe to make Celtics fans feel a little bit better, depending upon how they view Malcolm Brogdon at the current juncture, the Pacers did go out and give an offer sheet last summer to DeAndre Ayton. I myself was very skeptical that Miles Turner would still be on the roster after that happened, let alone do a renegotiation extend and have him come out afterwards and, be tweeting like it was always you, Indiana, and be very committed to staying here, even though they went out and tried to actually upgrade his position. So you never know how guys are going to react to that. For Miles, everything shook out really well, and he formed really good chemistry with Tyrese, and it was best for him financially to take the shorter term deal where he could get out later on. It was good business for the Pacers to re-sign him as well. So, maybe something happens with Malcolm there where if they do need to keep him on the roster, it all works out okay and he's all right with the role. I don't know. To me, it kind of seems like it's going to be the case where they're not going to be quite done yet this summer, though. I don't know exactly
seem
where you
like it.
stand on that and what reporting. It kind of seems to me like you're still going to end up moving Malcolm, and hopefully you get another ball handler next to Derek White, because to me, in addition to everything you're losing from Marcus Smart defensively, and I know he took a slight step back from, his Defensive Player of the Year season, he's the most creative passer on that roster, in my opinion, from a playmaking standpoint. So you're going to have to replace some of that, because this offense to me was already a little bit, drive, pass, catch, hold, maybe drive again. And if you don't have Marcus there to be doing some of that in the pick and roll, you're going to have to address that some way, shape, or form, whether that's Brogdon going back to running some offense, which he's not the most creative pick and roll passer. He's kind of more of a guy who finds the open man. He doesn't necessarily pass people open when he's running the pick and roll, and that includes his time when he was playing with Sabonis. But you're either going to have to repair what that was, or you're going to have to flip him and hope that you can get somebody else to fulfill some of that next to Derek White, in my opinion.
Yeah, and shot making masked a lot of that stuff you mentioned there last year for him. It's just a incredible shooting year, and he in the past playing next to stars, namely Giannis back in the day, the 50, 40, 90 years. It felt like everything he put up last year went in. And that's what still intrigues me, because, the name of the game at the end of the day is putting the ball in the basket. And he did that at a high level, specifically from three. That scoring drove his six-man case, and he was just red hot all year. I was astounded. Guys go have their ups and downs throughout the year. He really felt hot the whole way through, right up until that injury. And the room he had to operate with around Tatum and Brown translated into a great scoring year for him. But like you said, the passing impact didn't really happen here with the ball in his hands. Obviously, he was off the ball quite a bit. Wasn't always the main ball handler on the court, specifically in crunch time. Whether he was out there with Smart or Tatum or whoever it might be, those guys often had the ball in their hands over him, which is great. You can hit him on that drive and kick, and he's going to hit those shots. But it impacted what he was able to do from a point guard perspective, and he will have to step back into that role here if he does stay on the roster. But defensively, and I harped on this all year, and at this point, what you're losing in Smart, I do think you kind of need to retain with Brogdon on the roster here, unless you're able to upgrade on him. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to. They'll have to get a little creative there. But defensively, the numbers were bad, especially in isolation. really struggled keeping guys in front of him. I don't think he looked great movement-wise on that end. He's never been the most fluid, side-to-side guy defensively, but he struggled in a big way this year on that end, and that at times I think took from this team's defensive identity the year before. Strong in the post, if he was defending bigger guys, he could really keep them in front of him, use that low center of gravity, strong core, and defend up positions when they were switching. But on the perimeter against those quicker guards, it really ended up being a tough year for him defensively. But offensively, he was so red hot and making shots left and right that it ended up working out as a net positive in my mind. And I don't want to see them just dump him salary-wise. I still think there's a net positive from having Brogdon around, not only on the court, but off the court, that I think they need.
And I think that's a good point too, because when you're bringing it over Porzingis, there's a difference between even just looking at Marcus Smart and Derek White as defenders. Marcus Smart's really more somebody who's going to get up under your skin. He's going to skirt screens, whereas Derek White's somebody who's going to guide you over the top of the screen and funnel. And in some ways, that will fit nicely next to Porzingis because you're going to have to be funneling more of the action to him because this defense is going to become more interior based versus perimeter based. So, if it's Brogdon, that almost makes things tougher for him. Just from what I know of him and his time with the Pacers, is everything you just said, I think is really accurate. He struggles against quicker guards. His defensive positioning at the point of attack isn't always good. He doesn't always come out ready to defend. He's flat-footed. So if you're somebody that you're going to be putting Porzingis in drop and you're going to be needing to chase over, that's not going to be Malcolm Brogdon's best role. He's better suited to a switching defense where, like what you said, where you can switch, a 1-4 ball screen. And then because he is strong, if you get him in the post, there was times where the Pacers would be like, Brogdon, you're just guarding Karl Anthony Towns tonight. And he could kind of hold his own because, you're just guarding Pascal Siakam tonight. That's kind of more his lane, is defending bigger wings and being able to use his physicality in that regard. So if they're going to be altering the scheme at all to be accommodating Porzingis and making this more of, a drop coverage, more like what they saw last year, but even more so with Porzingis, I actually think Brogdon might struggle a little bit more with that than, if he had been in the original Udoka scheme more so.
Yes, and that combination of White and Brogdon could help him a little bit, maybe playing up a position on the wing against some bigger teams, not having to guard that point guard at the point of attack. Because White, all defensive guy last year,
Right.
Shifty enough to stay with those quicker guards. Going way back to the finals, I thought he did about as well as you possibly could against Steph Curry in that series up until, Curry had that legendary Game 4 and just broke through anything they put in front of him there. So, the funneling to Porzingis is going to be important, no doubt about it. That's how they want to play. They want to lure teams into those mid-rangers and play the percentages there. And they were number 2 defensively last year at the end of the day playing that. But things got shaky into the playoffs for a number of reasons. I mean, Brogdon got hurt in the East Finals, which killed him. He really couldn't even play at that point, and there's still a lot of mystery about how healthy he is. Seemed to reportedly play a part in that deal falling apart with the Clippers there. But the shift in this defense, to me, is still the big story going into this year. This was a team that did historic things under Udoka that year defensively, playing a different way. Now it seems like they're going toward more of an analytical approach to that end, and they still have great personnel to pair with that. I mean, like you said, Porzingis running that drop is probably about as good of a defender you can get in that spot, size-wise, namely there. You're not playing drop with Horford as much, who will let guys show over the top of him a lot, and you're playing bigger across the perimeter. I suspect it's going to be Smart, Brown, Tatum, Horford, Porzingis to start games. And, have Horford guarding the pick and roll or whatever it might be across the perimeter, depending on what it's going to be there, and Porzingis dropping. And I do like Horford switching across perimeter guys still, if there is that help behind them. But it's interesting just because it's so different from what this team did 2 years ago, especially losing Smart and Grant, your 2 switchiest guys. And I'm sure they're going to have great regular season production on that end, just doing these things. But when it comes down to playoff defense against some of the better offensive teams in the league, I'm curious how this is going to end up looking.
Well, I think that a tiny thing too that probably, I don't know how much it's getting talked about, but there's going to be a bit of a physicality deficit here too, Because, I mean, like you were talking about earlier with Grant Williams, not that he's a Jokic stopper, but he was a guy that you could put on Jokic. Like, they don't really have a lot of physical defenders in that regard on this roster because that's not who Porzingis is. I don't really think that's who Robert Williams is. I don't think that's really what you want him doing. And even just like on the minor fringe signings, like what I said before, like that's not who Oshae Brissett is either. He looks physically like that's what he should be, but his core strength isn't there to really be holding up in that type of
Yeah,
regard. And
these are
you,
these are
you lose that from
positional
Marcus Smart as
defenders.
well too. Yeah.
Yeah, these are positional defenders. They're going to fill a lot of space. They're going to guard the important parts of the floor. But when it comes to having that guy who's going to stop the one who's, running the pick and roll, the star who's taking all those shots and backing guys down, like a Jimmy Butler per se, the big guys in the East, as you mentioned there. Horford's still, I think, capable. I mean, Horford's gotten so much criticism for his postseason. I really don't get it. I mean, he was put in some tough spots out there, and the minute load on him, I think, just wore him down. Versatility-wise and strength-wise, that stuff you mentioned with Grant, I think he can fill a lot of that still, especially if they manage him well throughout the course of the regular season. But you're right, it's that physicality factor and really bringing the attack to the offense that I think is so different from what this team did a couple of years ago. Now it's going to be more about taking away the rim, taking away threes, and trying to play the percentages with that mid-range shot against opposing teams. But as we saw in the playoffs, some teams are comfortable with that shot. And if they can hit it and get hot enough from there, like the Heat did, and some of these other teams did, the Hawks did it round one, that can hurt you. And it's tough to adjust away from that if that's going to be your bread and butter and you're banking on teams missing those.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, like, I didn't get to hear Brad Stevens' press conference or the one with Porzingis when he came over, but it just kind of feels to me like this was a play for, we've seen what we're doing running out these, 5 out or 5 guard lineups with supposed dribble, pass, and shoot guys, and maybe we've kind of topped out with what we can be with that. So, you go over and you get Porzingis, and you're more so going all in on scoring and hoping that you can have different modes of attack when you get into the playoffs. I know that they talked about, being able to use Porzingis in the post, and that isn't really an area that the Celtics necessarily had. So if you do get up against a switching team, you have somebody you can throw the ball to, and that's certainly going to be something interesting to watch. Because I'm remembering all of the studying I did of Rick Carlisle before he came into the Pacers and watching that playoff series between the Mavs and the Clippers. And obviously Porzingis will be used differently with Boston than what was the case alongside Luka Doncic, but just remembering like how much the switching bothered Porzingis. Like, I remember Terrence Mann pushing Porzingis clear outside the pinch post and him taking like post ups from the nail and trying to just shoot over the top. And I think with the Wizards, you did see Porzingis getting closer to the basket where the average distance of his post ups really did go down. And that's not really something that the Celtics necessarily were able to tap into last year. So it kind of feels like that's just the play that they're kind of understanding. Hey, we might take somewhat of a step back defensively, but we're hoping for the offensive versatility. Maybe you can run a little bit of stuff through Porzingis where maybe you're using him at the elbow and he can throw some backdoor passes now and again, or maybe you could run some delay where you're not going to do a ton of that with Robert Williams. I have seen him do it, but you're not going to do it, regularly. Plus,
Right.
guys, if you're running Porzingis in delay, defenders have to play up against him because he's actually a threat to shoot. Whereas if Robert Williams is doing it, even if he is capable of throwing the passes, you don't have to guard him. So, it does give you a little bit of a different look. I'm guessing that's what the calculus was for Brad Stevens and why he made that move, as controversial as it was. Or at least it seemed controversial from the outside looking in.
It's hard to let go of Smart in those 9 years and everything he did here. And yes, the returns grew a little inconsistent over the last 3 years here, but at his best, he was a big-time impactful player, and I think that's going to help out Memphis a lot if he is playing at his best there. It's a great contract, too. There's intangible things with this team. Clearly, I mean, this team a year ago was as skilled as any in the NBA, and even down 0-3, the betting odds and everything else, like, the perception around this team was that they just figure it out right up until they didn't. And now it's another talented roster. They gained some strengths in other areas. They, let up some weaknesses in areas by giving up some other stuff there. They might not be done. We'll see. But there's still a lot of questions from an intangible standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, stuff that's kind of hard to gauge. And the basketball is going to play out. And if Porzingis does open up other areas of the game and offensive flexibility, and they want to be an offensive team, it'll probably work out if he stays healthy. And that's another factor here. He's been injured pretty much every year of his career, even a relatively healthy year last year. Brogdon, tough to gauge his health going into this year. Seems like he won't have surgery, but you never know. So I don't know. I get why they did what they did here. I do wonder what it means for Rob. I mean, everyone's still kind of imagining the best version of Rob, which has been limited by injury and limited by, offensive limitations for him. And it just feels like, unfortunately, unless, you can think of some way that Rob and Porzingis could, coexist on the court together, this probably just puts him in more of a back seat on this roster, which for a guy making like 10, 11, $12 million a year here, that is realistically what you can expect from a guy like that. Some secondary limited minute bench production, some energy off the bench, maybe playing off the bench helps him stay healthier here. But a lot of people did always imagine something bigger, something more impactful and more involved from Robert Williams, which might never pan out here if Porzingis has taken that spot from him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are times where you could play double big. I mean, it doesn't hurt being able to put tension on defenses where if, you have Tatum dribbling off a double drag and you can have Porzingis who, like, he had a career shooting year last year, but it's not always fair to him to just look at the 3-point percentage because he does take difficult shots in terms of he is somebody who's going to shoot from 30 feet. And there is a value to having somebody at the 5 spot who can pull from that deep. I am one who typically tends to say that a 5 does not really stretch the defense. They simply get to take open shots. I don't think teams respond to that in the way that people necessarily think they do. But when you have Porzingis,
you're never seeing a 5 face guarding a guy at the 3-point line, really.
Right. Like typically that's what teams are willing to give up, and it just behooves you if you're able to hit those shots. But in the case of Porzingis, I think you can see some tension there because he is somebody who's going to pull from so many feet behind the 3-point line that you do defend a little bit higher. So, if you can roll Rob as the first screener and pop Porzingis as the second screener, I do think that there could be some utility in that. I don't know that that's something that they'll go to all the time, but it's always a good thing to be able to have different types of lineups that you can throw out there and use. So it remains to be seen.
I'm intrigued by it. It's always intriguing to get a 7'3" guy on the roster who's as skilled and can do as many things as Porzingis can, and he was great last year. So there's always an intrigue to getting that large of a presence on the court, and you could just see the way you said you didn't see Stevens' press conference. He was glowing. Like he was just smiling nonstop. You could tell this was his blockbuster move, his first big trade, and it could be the one that shakes this team to get over that hump and win the championship. They didn't have a big three, really do now if he plays to that potential. So we'll see how it pans out. Before we let Caitlin go, do want to briefly revisit the Tyrese Haliburton-Sabonis trade, one of the more controversial of recent years, recent NBA history, really. Kings got highly criticized for it. Ended up working out decently for them last year, and the Pacers did extend Haliburton this past week here. So he'll be that centerpiece for Indiana going forward, a guy that I do think has future NBA potential. First, one more brief break here. Minute to tell everybody about FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets. Win or lose, that's $200. You can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. All in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/Boston to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/Boston. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Haliburton, Sabonis. We kicked around for a long time, Caitlin, what that Sabonis deal would ultimately look like, and Haliburton comes flying in a day before the deadline, whatever it was. It was a little earlier than the deadline. And the impact ended up being immediate. He ends up becoming this rookie max contract extension level guy who already, hard to imagine he's still playing on that rookie deal. Just with how impactful he's been here over these last couple of years with Indiana. He's quickly become, I think, mine and many other favorite young player in the league. And it's not hard to imagine him, especially with some of the personnel improving around him now. Him really taking a leap over the next couple of years here is not just one of the best young players in the league, but one of the best players in the league, period. Like, he just blends scoring and facilitating at that point guard position in a way that's pretty rare.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing that you can say about Tyrese is obviously, at one point in the season, he was averaging 20 and 10. He was leading the league in assists. He had like a 3 game stretch where he didn't commit a turnover, which I think sometimes can go underrated. I mean, his defense is definitely going to need to improve. I don't know how many people realize exactly how much he was getting targeted at the back end of that season, and that's why they really needed to make upgrades defensively. Made stuff tough when he and Buddy were both out on the court, though I will say that, they outscored teams when both of them were out there very narrowly, which was better than their overall team net rating, but they lost the minutes, whether it was just Tyrese or it was just Buddy. But the fact that he doesn't turn the ball over made a pretty big impact when he was out for 10 games. Like, they got worse defensively, even though Tyrese himself isn't a great on-ball defender, because they weren't making as many shots, so they weren't able to set their defense as well, and they were turning the ball over a lot more. So he takes care of the ball, but I think him being a star who plays a very inclusive form of basketball, I think he led all guards in passes, led all guards in touches. He has the ball a lot, but he doesn't dominate the ball in the way that he does it. He will start possessions away from the ball. That was in part why, him playing with Andrew Nembhard was kind of intriguing to me over the long run, is being able to have these two guards playing together at the same time who both are very high feel, heady passers, so that, if he gets to a place in a playoff scenario down the road when the Pacers are good enough to be a playoff team, if he is, seeing extra attention, that they would have a secondary playmaker. And because he's such an effective shooter, that's actually something you can do with him. And I think that that's one of the strongest things the Pacers have going forward, is there's not a lot of players you can come up with that you'd be like, that guy won't fit with Tyrese Haliburton. Like, it's very hard to come up with stars that you're like, that's not going to work. Like, certainly the defense will matter, but he blends with almost every type of player that you think with, because he is able to play and manipulate the pick and roll, and he can play off ball. So that really is a strength for them for sure.
So one of the big benefits Bruce Brown got, maybe the biggest benefit any role player can play with in the league, is playing next to Nikola Jokic and everything he allowed Bruce Brown to do. You knew from day one almost it was a seamless fit, because you saw the signs in Brooklyn, playing next to Durant and the rest there. Even, on their shorthanded nights, he would do some really good things on the roll there. Also a guy who blends some playmaking. If you go way back to the Miami days and the Pistons days, like, he came into the league as a point guard and he's just molded himself into a guy who's so flexible. So he's leaving Jokic. There's no doubt that's going to hurt him to some degree. It would hurt anyone. But he is, as you said, about to take the floor with Haliburton. How do you see Haliburton opening up Brown's game and taking advantage of getting him into that offense?
Yeah, I mean, in Denver, it was all for him about cutting. He did way more pick and roll ball handling in Denver than what he had done in Brooklyn. And then a lot of transition, just really loading up in transition and catching those, water polo style passes from Jokic and really just shoving the ball down opponents' throats. He improved his footwork on finishing moves, where you would see, more of an in and out dribble, some push crosses, more nuance for him in that regard. I think, he's going to be able to still catch all those. Tyrese was a few spots below Jokic in throwing those passes, and he loves to push the ball, whether it's off a make or a miss. If it's off a make, you'll see him always peering over his shoulder. He doesn't want to waste any seconds before he even has the inbound pass. He's looking and surveying the lay of the land for where his teammates are. So Bruce right away will fit in right, like a glove there. And then I think that they will take some of what you saw in Brooklyn, where he would be used as a screener for Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving at times and slip into space. I think, the Pacers like to run certain sets. They call them corner, where the guy will come up out of the corner and screen for Tyrese. If they don't get anything on the slip there, then they reverse it. And a lot of times Mathern will come up out of the corner into a handoff, and then he'll attack. And Bruce kind of has this quirky thing to his game where he shot the ball way better from the right corner over his career than the left. Like, I'm talking, it's like a 20% swing on not like super low volume in the left corner either. So, I think that you'll see him coming up, screening for Tyrese in the right. You can have Benedict over in the left, ready to attack second side. I think the three of them will fit pretty well there. And then just having another guy that, if Tyrese does get blitzed, and then you can put Bruce in the short roll, he can make some connective passes. I think that that's maybe not something like what you said before, him being a point guard in the past. Like, if he catches it second side, he can attack baseline and kind of manipulate the weak side zone and make a pass there too. and that the Pacers didn't have a ton of guys. They were pretty high up in drives and passes last year, but they don't have a ton of guys who can actually, shift defenders if they catch the ball and move it. Like, that's not really who Benedict is. He's still somebody who's processing how to make kickouts. His first inclination when he catches the ball is to catch and drive and get to the basket. So Bruce will give them that as well. And then just defensively, Tyrese is a guy who needs to defend off ball. He's better navigating pin downs and using his off ball instincts and putting his arms in passing lanes. He tends to get overpowered at the point of attack, but you can put Bruce Brown at the point of attack. You can, give him some spot possessions here and there against fours, and they just really didn't have a lot of that last year. So some defensive malleability as well.
This is an exciting team. Of course, I'm sure you're thrilled to see Sabonis doing all he's doing in Sacramento. That's a real team now. That combination of Fox and Sabonis is about exciting as it gets in terms of basketball combinations out there. I've always loved Sabonis. I would have loved him here in Boston, unlocking Tatum and Brown, the way he's done for Fox and others out there in Sacramento. This really is, just to wrap this up, about as even of a trade so far, and we'll see how it plays out long term. They extend Sabonis as well here, which is another, full circle moment for this trade. But both teams just have to be leaving that trade, and this almost never happens. Loving it. And I'm sure some Sacramento fans lament it, but these two teams were in worse, more awkward positions, and now they both really seem to be moving in good directions.
And clear identities that are being built with those players in mind, for sure. I mean, that's something about Sabonis. People watch Jokic win the title, and like, Sabonis isn't Jokic. Like, we don't need to put him clear on that level. But in the sense that the Pacers did not have the pieces when he was still here to be able to run the type of handoff offense that the Sacramento Kings are running. The comparison that I would use is when he was still playing for the Pacers and he was still getting what numbers he was getting, which I thought was even more impressive. It was like watching a fountain with a burned out pump, because they just didn't have guys to be able to run those types of sets. And then, he goes to Sacramento and the water gets turned back on and you get to see exactly what all he can do. And, Mike Brown taking some of those Warriors concepts and implementing them with Sabonis. Some of the stuff that they did with Draymond and Golden State has really suited them well. And like, I don't often care about being right. And I did say at the time that, if it were me, I would not trade Tyrese Haliburton in the second year of his rookie contract. But I did point out that the way that trade was getting, critiqued at the time, I did think that was going to look bad in retrospect, because I just don't think people had watched Sabonis enough or realized what he was capable of to think that the trade was as bad as it was. So now he's on a team where he's, definitely being thought of as the fulcrum, and how they're building a roster around him with everything about him in mind. Clear down to, they get Chris Duarte a week ago. Chris and Sabonis had kind of started developing a wavelength in the wake of Doug McDermott leaving. They both speak Spanish. They're both very close, good friends, and now it looks like he's going to be joining Sabonis out in Sacramento. And the same with Tyrese. Like, the Pacers are very much building this team with him in mind in a way that they never did with Sabonis or even Victor Oladipo to a degree. It was more about them finding a complementary core. Now they're fully behind. Tyrese is our franchise player. He is our star. He dictates what our identity is, and we're going to go out and find players who fit that identity and fit us. So definitely two different shifts, and it's great to see both franchises benefiting from a deal at the same time.
I'll be excited for the first Celtics-Pacers game next year, seeing this team in person. Of course, out at Summer League, it is an interesting Summer League team here for Indiana. Just pulling it up real quick, who's going to be out there? Of course,
Ben, Andrew, Ijax.
Yeah, that's interesting, right?
Rotation players.
Yeah, they must want to work on something, right? And I'm sure some of those more experienced guys won't play a ton. That's just how it goes. But man, they really are sending the
A team,
the full roster out there. Yeah, Mathurin, Walker, Nembhard. Kendall Brown is going. Woodard, Isaiah Wong's in on the two-way deal. I liked him at Miami. Jackson, Shepard, a great shooter coming in. Lots to watch for from a Indiana perspective. The Boston roster, not as much. I mean, J.D. Davison's a little interesting as a long-term developmental prospect. Michael Mulder's a two-way guy who intrigued me a little bit last summer league with Miami. Some Maine guys, some overseas guys. Yeah, not a ton on the Boston front. So I'll be bouncing around to different teams. I am in summer league starting tomorrow. We'll have a post-game show here on the Garden Report after it's back-to-back games, Saturday, Sunday for the Celtics. So we'll bring you discussion on both games Sunday afternoon. Stay tuned for that, as well as more on-the-ground stuff from Celtics All Access here. For now, that's the Garden Report for this week. Caitlin, thanks for stopping by. Always enjoy talking to you again. Check her out at Patreon. youtube.com/basketball she wrote. We'll throw that in the description as well. Great to see you doing well, and always welcome here on the Garden Report. Appreciate the time.
Hey, thanks again for the invite, and thanks to all the Celtic fans who continue to put up with me coming over with all the players that keep seeming to be connected to both of these two teams.
Absolutely. All right. See you guys.